At the end of August 2025, a landmark meeting took place at the ECO summit in Tianjin, bringing together the leaders of Russia, China, and India. The capitals of these three countries are located nearly 6,000 kilometers apart. They have very little in common politically, and even less culturally. However, they are united by a force that is increasingly challenging the status of the United States as the dominant global superpower. For decades, the United States dominated the global stage without question. But today, a new reality is gradually taking shape on that is putting this leadership into doubt. That reality is BRICS. Originally, this alliance comprising Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa was widely viewed as an unviable coalition. Over time, however, it has gained tremendous power, while America confidently maintained its belief in its own superiority. What began as a group of 5 nations has now expanded to include nearly 20 countries, with another 30 waiting in line to join. Collectively, these countries now account for half of the world's population. Their economies are growing rapidly, and in 2023, they surpassed the United States for the first time in their share of global GDP. The influence of this alliance extends far beyond statistics. It is becoming increasingly tangible and is beginning to affect everyday life. Chinese corporations such as Alibaba now surpass American giants like Amazon and Meta in scale data wallet. Moreover, China alone has registered 6 times more artificial intelligence patents than the United States. In 2024, the app Moon became the most downloaded application in Europe. And when Western European countries imposed sanctions on Russian oil, who became its primary buyers? Yes, China and India. At the same time, the White House and the new US administration have taken steps that are revising 80-year-old foundations of Western partnerships. They have imposed extremely high tariffs on European countries, America's strongest allies for decades, and have begun questioning military alliances that were once considered unbreakable. Of course, BRICS member countries have their own problems. Many of the largest participants are led by authoritarian leaders whose ambitions often hinder consensus. But the key question is this: can this alliance overcome its internal contradictions and seize a historic opportunity to transform the global order? Or will it collapse under the weight of its own disagreements? History shows that whether an international alliance or a private company, everything depends on management and how leaders build strategy, negotiate terms, and defend interests. Unfortunately, this is something rarely taught in universities. The nuances of executive leadership are known only to strong managers who have held CEO positions for at least 5 years and have seen it all. To build a solid foundation of leadership, create strong executives, and scale a business, consider the Chief Executive Officer program from the Edison Academy. In 4 months, you will learn how to make strategic decisions and attract investors, manage business operations, and hire top talent. You will receive 219 lessons, 38 business case studies, 20 simulators, and over 100 templates and checklists that you can immediately apply in your work financial models, cost optimization tools, scaling strategies, and methods for entering new markets. The program is based on research into the real needs of CEOs and business owners and includes lectures from leading global universities featured in BA programs. Access to the materials and updates is unlimited. There is no schedule and no deadlines. You can combine the course with work and personal life. Submit an application via the link in the description or the QR code on screen, and with the promo code %, you will receive a 65% discount and a personal consultation with an expert for your case as a bonus. Today, predictions of eternal US dominance may seem naive, but in the 1990s, there were many solid reasons to believe they were accurate. For nearly 80 years, the world order revolved around 2 poles, the USSR and the United States. However, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the situation changed dramatically, and America remained the world's only superpower The United States accounted for 25 of the global economy and 40 of global military spending. The nation's power appeared unprecedented. But it wasn't just about economic strength. U.S. influence extended across most key global institutions. Organizations such as the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank were largely controlled by Washington, which held veto power over the appointment of their leadership. In practice, this meant that the United States single-handedly decided which developing countries would receive loans or financial assistance and on what terms. Countries that supported U.S. interests were rewarded, while those that opposed them were often cut off from vital funding. The situation was further aggravated by the fact that loans from these institutions were often issued under extremely harsh conditions. Such measures including cuts to government spending or the privatization of entire industries were frequently implemented long before those sectors of the economy were ready for real competition. And although these steps were likely critical for the stability of the global economic system, for many developing countries their consequences proved devastating. Soon, mass protests against institutions such as the International Monetary Fund became commonplace. They were driven by the strict conditions of structural adjustment programs. All of this created enormous demand among developing nations for an alternative yuan that for a long time simply did not exist. However, in the early 2000s, an event occurred that changed the rules of the game. A commodity boom took place. Due to rising demand caused by China's rapid industrialization and a wave of global economic growth, prices for oil and precious metals skyrocketed. For the United States, which spent billions annually importing these resources, this became a serious problem. But for the countries selling them, it was the equivalent of hitting the jackpot. Suddenly, governments that had spent decades struggling with external debt found themselves flooded with cash. The Russian economy showed rapid growth amid the rise in oil prices from $10 to $140 per barrel. Moreover, crude oil accounted for between 60 and 70 of the country's total exports. During this period, the country's GDP increased nearly tenfold. It was at this time that the idea of creating the BRICS alliance between Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa emerged. This group of countries accounted for nearly 3/4 of the world's mineral reserves. What had once been merely an abstract acronym coined by an investment bank was beginning to take shape as the foundation for something new. The logic was simple. By coordinating the supply of key global resources, these states could gain significant influence. In 2009, Vladimir Putin brought this idea to life by organizing the first BRICS summit. The entire world immediately took notice. That same year, Goldman Sachs, the very firm that had coined the BRIC term, published a report warning that this alliance could become a serious threat to the US-led global order. Suddenly, a prospect previously dismissed as unlikely that several developing countries from the global periphery could challenge the West no longer seemed so unrealistic. Of course, despite the serious ambitions of these states to become new global leaders, substantial obstacles stand in the way of practically implementing this course. Although talk of the decline of the American economy continues to gain momentum, it must be acknowledged that 80% of global trade is still conducted in US dollars. The US economy remains the largest in the world, and its military spending exceeds the combined expenditures of the next 9 countries. Additionally, 7 or 8 of the world's 10 largest companies are American, and they dominate sectors such as banking and technology. However, no empire is destined to remain at the top forever. And if we look more closely, BRICS may have more potential to challenge the United States than it appears at first glance. BRICS is not simply a union of similar states, like the European Union. It is a coalition of giant innovators. On one side are China and India, with massive economic scale, technological potential, and vast domestic markets, along with Russia, which is expanding its military power and energy influence. On the other side, the alliance includes younger, Resource-rich countries such as Brazil, South Africa, and new members like Saudi Arabia and Ethiopia. These countries concentrate enormous reserves of food and fuel and possess rapidly growing populations. The result is a kind of strategic symbiosis. Large economies provide capital, industrial capacity, and political weight, while younger, resource-rich states supply the raw materials and demographic momentum necessary to sustain global growth. Taken together, this represents something far greater than just a political club. This alliance is already beginning to take on the features of a prototype for an alternative global economic order. Based on this, the first key advantage of the BRICS countries is their demographic scale. Since the first summit, the group has expanded to 20 countries, uniting nearly 4 billion people, which is 13 times the population of the United States. And this gap continues to widen. While the populations of Europe and the West are stagnating, countries in Africa and Asia are demonstrating dynamic growth. However, numbers alone do not automatically translate into influence. For example, the average wage of a typical Indian worker is about 3 of what his American counterpart earns per hour, which limits global competitiveness. But this is precisely where the so-called catch-up development effect comes into play. Low wage levels in India are not critical, because the country does not need to invent technologies already created in the West. It can immediately move to implementing the most advanced systems. For example, a factory worker in India can jump directly from using a basic phone to a smartphone. African enterprises, in turn, are able to skip the development of landline telephone networks and immediately implement mobile banking. This is exactly why economic growth rates there are 4 times higher than in the West. This expansion has a very practical dimension. Since 2018, the combined GDP of the 20 BRICS countries has surpassed that of the entire G7. However, the real power of the alliance lies not only in scale. It lies in the creation of institutions capable of competing with the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, and of supporting countries of the Global South while bypassing Washington's political conditions. This process is already gradually gaining momentum, although through somewhat different economic instruments, with China playing the central role. Over the past 10 years, the Global Belt and Road Initiative has transformed into the largest infrastructure project of modern times. The volume of lending has reached $1 trillion, and the number of participating countries has exceeded 150. Implemented projects include a port in the Indian Ocean costing $1.30 billion, a military base at the entrance to the Suez Canal, and a network of high-speed railways connecting China with Europe through Central Asia. Clearly, this is not a random set of projects. All of them have strategic importance for shaping a new world order, ensuring control over key resources that will define the future of the global economy. This is precisely where BRICS' main instrument of influence lies. The alliance is gaining increasing control over trade routes and commodities, without which the rest of the world cannot function. In 2023, Saudi Arabia, Iran, and the UAE joined the group. As a result, BRICS now accounts for 44% of global oil production, the world's primary energy source. But it is not only about oil. These countries also hold more than 70% of the world's reserves of rare earth minerals, lithium, cobalt, and nickel. All of these metals are critically important for powering electric vehicles, wind turbines, and batteries. Thus, as other countries transition to green technologies, their dependence on these minerals will only increase. Here we can already see how BRICS is beginning to exert real influence. Let us consider a hypothetical scenario. Countries that urgently need oil or lithium for their electric vehicles may be able to purchase them only on the condition that they recognize Ukraine as part of Russia or that they exclusively use Chinese technologies in their state systems. And although such a development is quite realistic, it should not be overstated. The era of US dominance has not yet ended. However, instead of strengthening its position, Washington appears to be undermining it. Key tariffs introduced by the Trump administration have created unprecedented costs for foreign companies, including long-standing allies such as Canada, the EU, Japan, and Australia. Moreover, the financial consequences are only beginning to manifest. As the cost of exporting to the United States rises, countries will logically turn to other large markets such as China and India, where billions of consumers are only now entering the middle class. Economists predict that the United States risks losing up to $500 billion in global trade as imposed tariffs push businesses to reorient toward BRICS countries. In the past, the United States strengthened its hegemony through soft power, foreign aid, opening universities to international students, and promoting the ideals of freedom and democracy. This approach helped create an extensive network of allies that reinforced its status as a superpower. However, the tightening of immigration policy and a departure from the principles of openness have caused many of these allies to question the reliability of support from Washington, and Trump's actions have only intensified these doubts. He publicly praised Xi Jinping's authoritarian rule and stated that Russia's invasion of Ukraine was a brilliant and clever move. The United States then carried out strikes on Iran's nuclear facilities, which many Arab countries perceived as a blatant violation of Iran's sovereignty, further escalating tensions in the region. The coming decades present BRICS with a historic opportunity to push the United States into the background. However, in order to do so, the member countries will need to achieve something they have never managed before: to find common ground with one another. Holding conferences and ceremonial handshakes is one thing, but it is difficult to claim that all of these leaders feel mutual sympathy. China and India, for example, have been engaged in a border conflict for many years. Beyond geopolitics, BRICS has very little in common culturally, historically, or politically, and alliances are built not only on money. The EU and NATO have remained strong because they are united by shared values: democracy, human rights, and open markets. BRICS does not have this. The members of this alliance differ greatly from one another. China is a one-party state. India is the world's largest democracy, while countries such as Saudi Arabia and Iran are theocracies. With such limited cultural, political, and historical overlap, transforming an economic partnership into genuine strategic unity becomes an extremely difficult task. The conflict between Russia and Ukraine serves as a clear illustration of this problem. On the one hand, it has allowed BRICS members to bypass Western sanctions, but on the other hand, it has exposed serious internal contradictions as Brazil and South Africa adopted a more restrained position. Naturally, with this level of disunity among participants, progress toward any common goals slows across all areas. The lack of coordination becomes a serious obstacle to their ambitions of replacing the dollar as the world's primary currency. Given the dominance of American banks in the global financial system, the storage of reserves by foreign governments in dollars, and the prevalence of this currency in international trade, this task is inherently difficult. However, internal differences lead some BRICS countries to fear excessive Chinese influence and to be unwilling to accept the yuan as an alternative reserve currency. More importantly, states that have political disagreements with one another are unable to reach consensus on the creation of unified institutions and the implementation of coordinated monetary policy. Simply put, there are too many conflicting goals and beliefs to implement a single unified strategy. Thus, although the United States is experiencing a period of instability, and BRICS has economic growth, population, and resources on its side, its path to genuine success cannot yet be considered predetermined. The main question that still remains to be answered is the following: will this alliance of diverse countries be able to set aside their contradictions and take advantage of the emerging opportunities, or will they continue to develop without the necessary coordination that alone can provide them with real global influence? Time will tell.